At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, when the executive floors of Meridian Technologies stood empty except for the hum of computers and the distant city lights filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard Agustin noticed something that would save a life. The 38-year-old night janitor was methodically cleaning the marble floors of the corporate headquarters when he spotted CEO Emily Cooper slumped over her mahogany desk, her breathing shallow and her lips displaying a telltale blue tint that most people would dismiss as exhaustion. But Richard wasn't most people, and what happened next would shock everyone who thought they knew what a janitor was capable of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gleaming towers of downtown Riverside stood like glass monuments to corporate success, their lights creating a constellation against the October sky. Inside the 47th floor of Meridian Technologies, Richard pushed his cart through corridors lined with awards and achievements that belonged to a world he cleaned but never inhabited. His reflection moved ghost-like across the polished surfaces, a figure in navy coveralls navigating between leather chairs worth more than his monthly rent and conference tables where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made daily. Richard had been walking these halls for 3 years now, ever since his world collapsed and he'd needed work that paid enough to support his 12-year-old daughter Maya while still allowing him to be home when she got out of school. The night shift at Meridian paid better than most janitorial positions, and the building's prestige meant job security. What his supervisors didn't know, what nobody in the gleaming corporate tower knew, was that the man emptying their trash cans held a PhD in toxicology from Stanford University. Dr. Richard Agustin had once been on the fast track to revolutionizing poison control centers across the country. His research on rare toxin identification had been published in medical journals, and pharmaceutical companies had courted him with offers that promised both wealth and the opportunity to save lives on a massive scale. But life had a way of rewriting even the most carefully planned trajectories. When his wife Sarah was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that required experimental treatments not covered by insurance, Richard had liquidated everything, his research lab, his consulting contracts, even their home, to pay for procedures that might buy her more time. The treatments had worked for a while. Sarah lived 2 more years, long enough to see Maya start middle school, long enough to make Richard promise that he'd never let their daughter's dreams be limited by circumstances. But when the medical bills finally outweighed their savings, when the experimental treatment stopped working, and when Sarah passed away, leaving behind a brilliant daughter and a mountain of debt, Richard discovered that prestigious PhDs didn't always translate to immediate employment, especially when you'd been out of the research game for 2 years caring for a dying spouse. So he'd taken the first job that offered steady income and flexible hours. Meridian Technologies didn't care about his academic credentials when he applied for the night janitor position. They cared that he could pass a background check, show up reliably, and clean offices without disturbing the important work that happened during business hours. What they got was someone who understood the molecular structure of industrial cleaners better than the chemists who formulated them, and who could identify toxic exposure symptoms that would escape the notice of most emergency room doctors. The irony wasn't lost on him. During the day, Maya attended Westfield Academy on a partial scholarship he'd fought to maintain, studying advanced chemistry and biology with the same passion that had once driven his own career. She talked about following in his footsteps, about becoming a scientist who could help people, about using knowledge to make the world safer. Richard encouraged her dreams while emptying waste baskets and mopping floors, holding on to the hope that her path would be smoother than his had been. Tonight felt different, though. The October air carried an unusual chill that had crept into the building, despite the climate control systems, and Richard had noticed subtle changes in the executive wing that his trained eye couldn't ignore. The coffee stations showed signs of unusual residue. The air circulation pattern seemed slightly off. Small details that meant nothing to most people, but triggered the analytical instincts he'd never fully suppressed. As he approached Emily Cooper's corner office, the massive space that commanded a view of the entire Riverside skyline, Richard noticed the lights were still on, unusual for this time of night. Emily Cooper was known for her long hours, but she typically left by 10 p.m. to maintain some semblance of work-life balance. Her office, with its modern art and carefully curated bookshelves, represented the pinnacle of corporate success. As CEO of one of the region's fastest-growing tech companies, she commanded respect from competitors and loyalty from employees who appreciated her hands-on leadership style. But as Richard entered the office to empty the trash and dust the surfaces, he saw Emily slumped forward over her desk, her usually perfectly styled auburn hair falling across papers scattered with what appeared to be notes from her evening meetings. Her breathing was labored, almost imperceptible, and her skin had taken on a pallor that immediately triggered every alarm bell in Richard's scientifically trained mind. Most people would have called 911 immediately. Most people would have assumed a heart attack or stroke. Most people wouldn't have noticed the specific combination of symptoms that Richard's expertise allowed him to recognize. The slight cherry-red tinge beneath her pale complexion, the specific pattern of her breathing, the almost imperceptible sweet almond scent that lingered in the air around her. Richard Agustin wasn't most people, and what he was about to do would transform both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine, proving that sometimes the most important knowledge comes from the most unexpected places, and that heroes don't always wear lab coats. Sometimes they wear coveralls and carry mop buckets while harboring the expertise to save lives when it matters most. The clock on Emily's desk read 11:52 p.m. In the next few minutes, Richard would face a choice that would test everything he'd learned in his former life as a toxicologist, everything he'd sacrificed for his daughter's future, and everything he believed about second chances and the value of knowledge that never truly disappears, even when circumstances force it into the shadows. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Riverside General Hospital had burned into Richard's memory like a brand, marking the exact moment his life had split into before and after. 2 years earlier, he'd sat in those same uncomfortable plastic chairs, holding Sarah's trembling hand while doctors delivered news that would unravel everything they'd built together. Stage 4 neurological degeneration, they'd said, using clinical terms that couldn't capture the devastation of watching the brilliant woman he'd married slowly lose pieces of herself. Sarah Agustin had been more than his wife. She'd been his research partner, his intellectual equal, and the steady voice of reason that kept his ambitious toxicology projects grounded in real-world applications. They'd met during their graduate studies at Stanford, two minds fascinated by the intersection of chemistry and medicine, drawn together by late nights in the lab and a shared vision of using science to protect people from invisible dangers. Their wedding photo, now tucked away in a box Maya had never asked to see, showed two young scientists confident that knowledge could solve any problem, that hard work and dedication would guarantee a future filled with groundbreaking discoveries and comfortable security. The experimental treatment had cost $180,000 for the first round alone. Insurance had covered exactly none of it, classifying the procedure as investigational despite promising preliminary results from trials in Switzerland. Richard had liquidated his stock options, cashed out his retirement accounts, and taken a second mortgage on their Palo Alto home, a modest 3-bedroom place that had seemed like a palace when they'd first bought it with dual academic salaries and bright futures stretching ahead. When the first treatment showed signs of slowing Sarah's deterioration, they'd celebrated with cautious optimism and prepared for round 2, another $160,000. Richard sold his prized vintage motorcycle, the one he'd restored in his garage during graduate school weekends. He'd borrowed against his life insurance policy and accepted loans from colleagues who understood that desperation made financial prudence irrelevant. The third treatment had required traveling to a clinic in Germany, where specialists offered procedures unavailable in the United States. The medical tourism had cost $200,000, including flights, hotels, and 2 months of living expenses while Sarah underwent intensive therapy. Richard had maxed out credit cards and accepted a hard money loan secured by their house, the kind of desperate financing that carried interest rates designed to trap people who had run out of conventional options. For 18 months, the treatments had given them hope. Sarah's decline had stabilized, her cognitive function had improved, and she'd been able to return to teaching chemistry at the local community college. Maya, then 10 years old, had her mother back for bedtime stories and homework help. Richard had returned to his research with renewed passion, driven by first-hand understanding of how medical breakthroughs could save families from the kind of devastation they'd narrowly avoided. But experimental treatments, by definition, came with no guarantees. Sarah's condition had resurged with vengeant intensity, progressing faster than before, as if making up for lost time. The final 6 months had been a blur of emergency room visits, specialist consultations, and increasingly desperate searches for clinical trials that might offer one more chance. Richard had spent every available dollar and mortgaged every possible asset, transforming their comfortable middle-class life into a financial house of cards that collapsed the moment Sarah's medical needs outpaced his ability to pay. The funeral had been small, attended by colleagues who offered condolences and carefully worded suggestions about grief counseling and financial planning. Richard had sat in the front pew holding Maya's hand, calculating how many months they could survive on his remaining savings while searching for a new career that could support a grieving 12-year-old whose academic potential deserved better than the public school system's overwhelmed resources. Maya's acceptance to Westfield Academy had arrived 3 weeks after the funeral, a partial scholarship that covered 60% of tuition for students demonstrating exceptional aptitude in science and mathematics. The remaining 40% might as well have been $4 million for a man whose credit rating had been destroyed by medical debt and whose resume showed a 2-year gap that potential employers viewed with suspicion. The night janitor position at Meridian Technologies had been the first job offer that came with benefits and a schedule allowing him to be home when Maya finished school. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd once identified toxins that stumped poison control centers across 3 states now cleaned the offices of people who made decisions about workplace safety without understanding the molecular basis of the chemicals they mandated. But Maya needed stability more than his ego needed validation. At 12, she'd already demonstrated the kind of intellectual curiosity that reminded of Sarah, asking questions about chemical reactions and molecular biology that challenged him to remember lessons from graduate school. Her science fair projects had evolved from simple experiments to sophisticated investigations that impressed teachers who didn't realize her father had once published papers on similar topics in peer-reviewed journals. The scholarship that kept Maya at Westfield Academy required maintaining specific academic standards and participating in extracurricular activities that demonstrated continued excellence. Richard attended every parent-teacher conference, every science fair presentation, every academic recognition ceremony, wearing his best thrift store clothes and smiling proudly while surrounded by parents whose careers hadn't been derailed by medical catastrophe. "She has remarkable potential," Maya's chemistry teacher had told him at the last conference. "With the right guidance and opportunities, she could pursue any scientific field she chooses. You should be very proud of the foundation you've provided." Richard had nodded and thanked her, not mentioning that the foundation had been built from the rubble of his own career, cemented together with night shifts and sacrifice. Every evening when he arrived home from his day of sleep, the necessary rest between Maya's school departure and his own work beginning, she would update him on her classes, her experiments, her plans for college applications that were still years away but already consuming her thoughts. She talked about following his path into toxicology, about researching treatments for neurological conditions, about using science to help families facing the same challenges they'd survived. Richard encouraged her dreams while carefully avoiding details about how dramatically his own path had diverged from the trajectory she imagined. Maya knew he'd been a scientist before her mother's illness, but she didn't know about the published papers gathering dust in academic databases, the research projects abandoned midstream, or the professional connections that had grown cold during his years of caregiving and financial crisis. What she did know was that her father understood chemistry in ways that impressed her teachers, that he could explain complex molecular interactions during homework sessions, and that he somehow managed to afford her education and their modest apartment despite working a job that her classmates' parents probably didn't consider a real career. The apartment they shared was a far cry from their former Palo Alto home, but Maya had adapted with the resilience that children often display when adults try to protect them from the full weight of circumstances. Her bedroom was decorated with periodic table posters and chemistry sets. Her bookshelf filled with advanced science texts that Richard bought used from online sellers who didn't know they were selling graduate-level materials to a 12-year-old. 3 years into his janitorial career, Richard had developed routines that maximized his time with Maya while maintaining the income they needed to survive. He slept from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., picked her up from school, helped with homework, shared dinner, and arrived at Meridian Technologies by 10 p.m. for shifts that ended just as she was leaving for school the next morning. The schedule was exhausting, but it worked, providing stability in a life that had seen too much uncertainty. But tonight, as he stood in Emily Cooper's office watching a successful CEO struggle with symptoms that triggered every instinct from his abandoned career, Richard faced a moment that would test whether his scientific knowledge was truly gone or simply dormant, waiting for circumstances that demanded its return. The man who'd once saved lives through research was about to discover whether he could save a life through direct intervention, using expertise that nobody knew he possessed to recognize dangers that others would miss completely. The alarm clock's gentle chime at 3:15 had become Richard's sunrise, marking the transition from his world of sleep to his world of responsibility. The modest two-bedroom apartment on Maple Street bore little resemblance to the Palo Alto home where he'd once planned experiments over morning coffee, but it had become their sanctuary, a place where Maya could spread her chemistry homework across the kitchen table while he prepared their evening meal with the methodical precision that had once characterized his laboratory work. Maya burst through the front door with the energy of a 12-year-old whose mind had been stimulated by 8 hours of advanced coursework, her backpack heavy with textbooks that would challenge many college students. "Dad, you'll never guess what happened in advanced biology today," she announced, dropping her bag beside the door with a thud that had become as familiar as breathing. Her dark hair, inherited from Sarah, caught the afternoon light streaming through their small living room window, and her eyes held the same intellectual curiosity that had first attracted Richard to her mother years earlier. "Let me guess," Richard said, emerging from the kitchen with a glass of water and the patient smile he'd perfected during 3 years of single parenthood. "Dr. Hammond assigned another project that's technically meant for high school seniors, and you're already planning how to exceed his expectations." The routine had become comfortable, predictable, in ways that provided stability after years of medical uncertainty and financial chaos. "Close, but better," Maya said, pulling out a folder that contained what appeared to be research papers far too advanced for middle school. "He's entering 3 students in the regional science fair competition, and I'm one of them. The theme is environmental toxicology, and I get to design my own experiment about how chemical pollutants affect cellular function in aquatic organisms." Her excitement was infectious, the kind of pure academic enthusiasm that reminded Richard of his own graduate school days, when discovering new knowledge felt like unlocking secrets of the universe. Richard felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern wash over him. Maya's intellectual gifts were undeniable, but advanced competitions meant additional costs: materials, transportation, presentation boards, and the kind of equipment that other students' parents could provide without calculating the impact on monthly budgets. "That's incredible, sweetheart. Tell me about your project idea while I finish dinner." The kitchen was small but efficient, organized with the same attention to detail that had once characterized Richard's laboratory spaces. Maya settled at the table that served as both dining area and homework station, spreading out her preliminary research while he stirred the pasta sauce he'd been preparing since waking up. The familiar ritual of cooking while Maya discussed her schoolwork had become one of the day's highlights, a time when he could remember what it felt like to engage with scientific concepts without the weight of lost career opportunities. "I want to test how different industrial cleaning chemicals affect algae growth patterns," Maya explained, her notebook already filling with sketches and chemical formulas that demonstrated understanding far beyond her grade level. "Dr. Hammond said I could use the school's microscopy lab, but I need to source my own test chemicals and design the experimental protocols myself." Her enthusiasm was tempered by the practical considerations she'd learned to navigate: understanding that her family's resources required careful planning. Richard paused in his stirring, recognizing the irony of the situation. His current job brought him into daily contact with exactly the kinds of industrial cleaning chemicals Maya wanted to study, and his abandoned expertise in toxicology made him uniquely qualified to help design protocols that would ensure both scientific validity and safety. But explaining that would require discussing parts of his past that he'd carefully avoided, details that might make Maya feel responsible for his career sacrifice. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" he asked instead, beginning to calculate whether their tight budget could accommodate the additional expenses. The regional competition would be an incredible opportunity for Maya, the kind of recognition that could strengthen her college applications and potentially lead to additional scholarship opportunities. 6 weeks for initial research, then 2 months for experimentation and data analysis, Maya said, consulting the timeline Dr. Hammond had provided. "The presentation is in early January, which means I'll be working on this through the holidays." She looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who'd already identified potential obstacles. "Dad, I know the materials might be expensive. If it's too much, I can ask Dr. Hammond about simpler projects that don't require specialized chemicals." The offer broke Richard's heart and strengthened his resolve simultaneously. Maya had learned to self-edit her dreams based on financial reality, a survival skill that no 12-year-old should need to develop. "We'll make it work," he said firmly, though he was already mentally reviewing their budget and considering which expenses could be reduced. "Your education is worth any sacrifice." Their evening routine continued with the comfortable predictability that had sustained them through 3 years of rebuilding. Maya worked on her regular homework while Richard prepared their simple dinner, the kitchen filled with the sounds of pencil on paper and gentle conversation about chemical reactions and molecular biology. The apartment was small, but it contained everything they needed: books, a computer for research, and the kind of quiet security that allowed Maya to focus on her studies without worrying about adult concerns. At 6:30, they shared dinner at the small table, discussing Maya's classes with the detailed attention that other families might devote to sports or entertainment. Richard had become expert at asking questions that demonstrated interest without revealing the depth of his own knowledge, encouraging her intellectual development while maintaining the fiction that his understanding came from general education rather than advanced degrees. "Mrs. Patterson wants to schedule a conference about my academic trajectory," Maya mentioned, between bites of pasta. "She says I'm ready for AP chemistry, but that's usually a high school course. She wants to discuss whether Westfield can arrange something special, maybe dual enrollment with the community college." The suggestion represented both opportunity and challenge: advanced coursework that could accelerate Maya's academic development but might strain resources even further. Richard nodded, making mental notes about conversations he'd need to have with administrators and potentially college registrars. Maya's intellectual gifts required careful cultivation, the kind of educational planning that demanded both advocacy and financial creativity. "We'll meet with her next week and explore all the options," he promised, though he was already wondering how community college courses would affect their current scholarship arrangements. After dinner, Maya returned to her homework while Richard prepared for his own workday, gathering the cleaning supplies and equipment that had become as familiar as the laboratory tools he'd once used daily. The transition from academic discussion to janitorial preparation required a mental shift that had become routine but never entirely comfortable. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to find satisfaction in work that provided for Maya's future, even when it bore no resemblance to the career he'd once planned. At 8:45, Richard kissed Maya goodbye, leaving her with homework, instructions about locking the door, and the emergency numbers that had become unnecessary after 3 years of responsible independence. She would finish her studies, prepare for bed, and be asleep by the time he returned from his shift, maintaining the schedule that allowed him to be present for her school pickup and evening routine. The drive to Meridian Technologies took him through neighborhoods that reflected the economic stratification of modern Riverside, from their modest apartment complex to the gleaming downtown district where corporate headquarters rose like monuments to success. Richard had learned to navigate this transition without bitterness, understanding that his current circumstances were temporary challenges rather than permanent limitations. The employee entrance at Meridian Technologies led to a basement locker room where Richard changed into his coveralls and gathered his equipment, joining the small crew of night workers who maintained the building's pristine appearance. His colleagues were good people, immigrants and students, retirees and career cleaners who approached their work with professional pride despite society's tendency to overlook their contributions. "Evening, Dr. Agustin," called Janet Rivera, the crew supervisor, who'd somehow learned about Richard's educational background and insisted on using his academic title despite his protests. "How's that brilliant daughter of yours?" Janet was 62, a grandmother who'd worked nights for 15 years to help pay for her own children's college educations, and she understood the sacrifices that education required. "Working on a science fair project that's going to change the world," Richard replied, the pride in his voice unmistakable. "She wants to study environmental toxicology, which hits pretty close to home." The statement was more revealing than he'd intended, but Janet had earned his trust through 3 years of respectful supervision and genuine interest in his family's welfare. As Richard began his nightly routine, moving through the executive floors with practiced efficiency, he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that his work directly supported Maya's education and future opportunities. The building's marble floors and mahogany furniture might belong to a world he'd left behind, but every hour of cleaning brought Maya closer to the scientific career she dreamed about, the career he'd once had and hoped she might reclaim in her own generation. The first sign that something was wrong at Meridian Technologies came on a Monday evening in early November, when Richard noticed an unusual chemical residue in Emily Cooper's private bathroom. As he cleaned the executive washroom adjoining the CEO's office, his trained eye caught something that would have escaped notice from anyone without advanced chemistry knowledge: a faint crystalline deposit around the sink drain that didn't match any of the standard cleaning products or personal care items typically found in corporate facilities. Richard paused, his cleaning cloth suspended over the marble countertop as he examined the residue more closely. The crystals were nearly invisible, requiring the right angle of light to detect, but their formation pattern suggested they'd precipitated from a solution rather than being deposited by normal use. His toxicology training kicked in automatically, cataloging the visual characteristics and trying to identify what compound might leave such distinctive traces. The residue could have been anything: medication that had been dissolved in water, a cleaning agent that someone had mixed improperly, or even residue from a dietary supplement. But something about the crystal structure nagged at Richard's memory, triggering recollections of graduate school lessons about compounds that formed similar precipitates. He made a mental note to observe more carefully in the coming days, though he told himself he was probably overanalyzing a perfectly innocent situation. Tuesday brought another anomaly. While emptying the executive break room trash, Richard discovered an unusual concentration of antacid wrappers and stomach medication packaging. Emily Cooper's personal assistant, Victoria Hartwell, had apparently been experiencing significant digestive distress based on the volume of over-the-counter remedies discarded in her workspace. More concerning was the presence of activated charcoal tablets, something people typically use only for suspected poisoning or severe gastrointestinal emergencies. Richard found himself studying the timestamps on medication receipts that had been carelessly thrown away, noting that Victoria had purchased increasingly strong remedies over the past 2 weeks. The progression from simple antacids to prescription-strength anti-nausea medication suggested escalating symptoms that weren't responding to standard treatments. As someone who'd spent years studying how toxins affect human physiology, Richard recognized the pattern of someone whose body was struggling to process something harmful. Wednesday's cleaning routine revealed even more troubling evidence. The air filtration system in the executive wing was working harder than usual, cycling at increased frequency as if compensating for airborne contaminants. Richard had learned to read the building's mechanical systems during his 3 years of employment, understanding how HVAC patterns reflect occupancy and environmental conditions. The current cycle suggested the presence of volatile compounds that the system was trying to eliminate. More specifically, the chemical air fresheners in Emily Cooper's office had been replaced twice in the past week, unusual for an executive who typically preferred minimal artificial fragrances. When Richard checked the supply closet logs, he discovered that facilities management had received multiple requests for stronger air freshening products and enhanced ventilation in the executive wing. Someone was trying to mask an odor that standard building systems couldn't eliminate. Thursday brought the most alarming discovery yet. While cleaning Emily Cooper's office, Richard noticed that her personal coffee maker, a high-end espresso machine that she used exclusively, had been moved from its usual position on the credenza to a location closer to the window. The relocation itself wasn't significant, but the faint discoloration around the water reservoir suggested someone had been adding substances beyond normal coffee grounds in water. Richard's scientific training compelled him to examine the area more closely. The discoloration pattern indicated repeated exposure to a compound that was slightly acidic and left mineral deposits when it evaporated. More concerning was the detection of what appeared to be sediment in the water reservoir, particles too fine to be normal mineral buildup from tap water, but substantial enough to suggest deliberate addition of foreign substances. The coffee maker's internal components showed signs of unusual wear, particularly the heating elements and internal tubing. Richard recognized the degradation pattern from his research days when he'd studied how various compounds affected different materials over time. Whatever was being added to Emily Cooper's coffee was corrosive enough to damage high-quality stainless steel components, suggesting either highly concentrated acids or metallic compounds that wouldn't occur naturally in beverage preparation. Friday evening brought confirmation that his growing concerns weren't paranoid overanalysis. While emptying wastebaskets in the executive conference room, Richard discovered medical consultation notes that Emily Cooper had apparently discarded after a private meeting with her physician. The notes, written in medical shorthand that his scientific background allowed him to decipher, documented symptoms that painted a disturbing picture. The physician had noted chronic fatigue, intermittent nausea, cognitive fogging, and unexplained muscle weakness, symptoms that had been developing gradually over several weeks. More significantly, Emily had reported a persistent metallic taste and periodic episodes of dizziness that seemed to worsen during her longest workdays. The doctor had recommended blood work to check for vitamin deficiencies and hormonal imbalances, but the symptom cluster raised immediate red flags for anyone familiar with toxicology. Richard realized that Emily Cooper was being systematically poisoned, and whoever was responsible had been escalating the dosage over time. The crystalline residues, the digestive distress affecting her assistant, the increased air filtration, and the damaged coffee machine components all pointed to a deliberate campaign of poisoning that was becoming increasingly sophisticated and dangerous. What made the situation particularly insidious was the gradual nature of the exposure. Rather than acute poisoning that would trigger immediate medical intervention, someone had chosen a method that mimicked common health problems: stress-related fatigue, workplace burnout, perhaps early signs of autoimmune conditions that busy executives often ignored until they became severe enough to require hospitalization. The most chilling aspect was the timing. Emily Cooper was scheduled to present Meridian Technologies' quarterly earnings report the following Tuesday, a presentation that would determine the company's stock valuation and potentially affect hundreds of employee jobs. If someone wanted to prevent that presentation or create circumstances that would damage Emily's credibility and the company's financial standing, chronic poisoning would be an effective strategy that would appear unrelated to corporate sabotage. Richard faced an impossible dilemma. His observations were based on scientific knowledge that he wasn't supposed to possess and training that his colleagues didn't know he'd received. Attempting to warn Emily Cooper about potential poisoning would require explaining how a night janitor had identified toxicological symptoms that medical professionals had missed, exposing his hidden background and potentially jeopardizing the job that supported Maya's education. More problematically, he had no concrete proof, only circumstantial evidence that would seem like paranoid speculation to anyone without advanced chemistry knowledge. The residues could be explained away, the symptoms could be attributed to stress, and the equipment damage could be dismissed as normal wear. Without access to laboratory testing equipment or the authority to demand medical examinations, Richard couldn't definitively prove that Emily Cooper was in danger. But his scientific conscience wouldn't allow him to ignore evidence that someone's life was at risk. As he finished his Friday night cleaning routine, Richard realized he was facing the same kind of moral choice that had driven his original career in toxicology: the responsibility to use knowledge to protect people from invisible dangers, even when doing so might come at personal cost. Saturday morning, as he prepared breakfast for Maya and listening to her excitement about her science fair project on environmental toxins, Richard understood that the next few days would test whether his abandoned expertise could save a life, and whether protecting someone else's safety was worth risking the stability he'd built for his daughter's future. Tuesday night at 11:47 p.m., the crisis Richard had been dreading finally materialized. He was methodically cleaning the marble floors of the 47th floor when he heard a muffled crash from Emily Cooper's corner office, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone struggling to breathe. His blood froze as he recognized the audio signature of respiratory distress, not the labored breathing of someone having a panic attack, but the specific gasping pattern of someone whose oxygen absorption was being chemically compromised. Richard abandoned his cleaning cart and rushed toward the source of the sound, his heart hammering as worst-case scenarios flooding his mind. Through the glass walls of Emily's office, he could see her slumped forward over her desk, her usually controlled posture replaced by the slack positioning of someone losing consciousness. Her laptop was still open, displaying what appeared to be the quarterly earnings presentation she'd been working on for weeks, but her hands had fallen away from the keyboard in a way that suggested sudden incapacitation. As Richard pushed open the office door, the smell hit him immediately, a faint but distinctive almond-like odor that sent every alarm bell in his toxicological training into overdrive. The scent was subtle enough that most people would dismiss it as room freshener or cleaning products, but Richard recognized it as the telltale signature of cyanide compounds, one of the most dangerous classes of poisons he'd studied during his graduate research. Emily's breathing was shallow and irregular, her lips displaying the classic cherry red coloration that indicated cellular oxygen deprivation despite adequate lung function. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that contrasted sharply with the red tinge around her mouth, creating the paradoxical coloring that emergency room doctors often miss when treating cyanide poisoning. Most medical professionals expect victims to appear blue from oxygen deprivation, not the counterintuitive reddish coloring that results from cells' inability to process oxygen. Richard's scientific training kicked into emergency mode as he rapidly assessed Emily's condition. Her pulse was rapid but weak, her pupils were dilated but responsive to light, and her breathing pattern indicated that her respiratory system was functioning, but her cellular metabolism was being disrupted at the molecular level. The symptoms painted a clear picture for someone with his background: acute cyanide poisoning, probably administered within the past 30 to 60 minutes based on the progression of symptoms. The coffee cup on Emily's desk was still warm, containing the dregs of what appeared to be her usual evening espresso. Richard's nose detected the same almond-like scent emanating from the liquid, confirming his suspicion that the poison had been delivered through her preferred beverage. The timing was diabolical. Emily typically stayed late on Tuesday evenings to finalize her quarterly presentations, and whoever had orchestrated this attack knew her routine well enough to predict when she'd be alone and vulnerable. Richard's mind raced through the treatment protocols he'd memorized during his toxicology research. Cyanide poisoning required immediate intervention with specific antidotes: oxygen therapy, sodium nitrite, and sodium thiosulfate administered in precise sequences that most emergency rooms weren't equipped to provide quickly enough. Without treatment, Emily had perhaps 15 to 20 minutes before the cellular damage became irreversible and potentially fatal. The nearest hospital was Riverside General, at least 12 minutes away by ambulance, assuming immediate response and no traffic complications. Even if paramedics arrived within 5 minutes, the transport time and emergency room evaluation process would likely exceed the window for effective treatment. Emily Cooper was going to die unless someone with specialized knowledge intervened immediately, using resources that weren't available in a corporate office building. Richard pulled out his cell phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911, knowing that even as he requested emergency medical assistance, the conventional response wouldn't be fast enough to save Emily's life. 911, what's your emergency? Came the dispatcher's calm voice, trained to handle crisis calls with professional efficiency. I need paramedics at Meridian Technologies, 47th floor, corner office. CEO Emily Cooper is unconscious with signs of acute poisoning. This is not a heart attack or stroke. She needs immediate treatment for cyanide toxicity. Richard's medical terminology caused a brief pause on the other end of the line, as dispatchers rarely received calls with such specific diagnostic information. "Sir, are you medical personnel? How do you know it's cyanide poisoning?" the dispatcher asked, following protocols designed to assess the credibility of emergency medical reports. Richard realized he was at the moment of truth. Revealing his expertise would invite questions he couldn't answer without exposing his entire hidden background, but withholding information might delay the specific treatment Emily needed to survive. "I have toxicology training. The symptoms are classic cyanide poisoning: cherry red lips, almond odor, rapid weak pulse with maintained breathing. She needs sodium nitrite and sodium thiosulfate, not standard cardiac protocols. Paramedics are en route, ETA 6 minutes. Stay on the line and monitor her breathing," the dispatcher instructed, but Richard could hear keyboard typing in the background as additional information was being relayed to the responding medical team. As Richard knelt beside Emily's chair, monitoring her deteriorating vital signs, he realized that even with his specific diagnostic information, the paramedics might not carry the specialized antidotes required for cyanide poisoning. Most ambulances are equipped for cardiac emergencies, trauma, and overdoses involving common street drugs, but exotic poisoning cases require hospital-based resources that might not be available until after cellular damage had become fatal. Emily's breathing was becoming more labored, and her skin color was shifting toward a blue-gray tone that indicated the poison was overwhelming her body's remaining oxygen processing capacity. Richard checked her pulse again, finding it increasingly weak and irregular. The symptoms suggested that whoever had poisoned her had used a substantial dose, probably intended to ensure rapid incapacitation and death that would appear to be sudden cardiac arrest in a stressed executive working late hours. The most infuriating aspect of the situation was that Richard knew exactly how to treat Emily's condition, but he lacked access to the medications and equipment necessary for intervention. His graduate research had included extensive work on cyanide antidotes, particularly the development of more effective delivery systems for emergency situations. He'd published papers on improving treatment protocols and had consulted with poison control centers about optimizing response procedures for industrial accidents. But that expertise was useless without sodium nitrite, sodium thiosulfate, and oxygen delivery systems that existed only in properly equipped medical facilities. Richard was watching someone die from a condition he could treat if he had access to the same resources he'd once used routinely in laboratory settings. But corporate office buildings weren't equipped for advanced toxicological emergencies. As Emily's condition continued to deteriorate, Richard faced a terrible realization. His hidden expertise had identified the problem correctly, but it might not be enough to save her life. The gap between knowledge and capability was measured in minutes that were slipping away, while Emily Cooper thought a battle at the cellular level that she couldn't win without immediate chemical intervention. The sound of sirens grew louder outside the building, but Richard knew that even the most competent paramedics would need time to assess the situation, confirm his diagnosis, and transport Emily to a facility equipped for exotic poisoning treatment. Time that Emily didn't have. measured against the relentless progression of cyanide toxicity that was shutting down her body's ability to process oxygen at the molecular level. Richard realized he was about to witness the death of someone he could have saved under different circumstances, someone whose poisoning he'd detected but couldn't prevent, and whose treatment he understood but couldn't provide. The weight of useless knowledge pressed down on him as Emily Cooper's breathing became increasingly shallow, and the seconds ticked away toward a tragedy that expertise alone couldn't prevent. Richard knelt beside Emily's deteriorating form, his mind racing through possibilities that existed in the gray area between proper medical protocol and desperate improvisation. The sirens were growing closer, but Emily's breathing was becoming more labored with each passing second, her body fighting a losing battle against cellular suffocation that no amount of conventional first aid could address. He faced a choice that would define not just this moment, but everything that followed. Remain within the boundaries of his janitor role and watch Emily die, or reveal the depth of his expertise and attempt an intervention that could save her life but destroy his carefully constructed new identity. The building's first aid stations were equipped with basic supplies: bandages, antiseptics, automated external defibrillators designed for cardiac emergencies. But Richard's toxicology background told him that Emily needed something far more specific, something that existed within the building but not in its medical supplies. His mind cataloged the cleaning chemicals stored in the facility's maintenance areas, the laboratory reagents used by Meridian's research division, and the various compounds that might be repurposed for emergency antidote synthesis. Meridian Technologies housed a small but well-equipped chemistry lab on the 43rd floor, used primarily for quality control testing of the company's electronic components. Richard had cleaned that facility hundreds of times over 3 years, familiarizing himself with its equipment and chemical inventory during long nights when scientific curiosity overcame professional boundaries. The lab contained sodium compounds, sulfur-based reagents, and precision measurement tools that could theoretically be used to create makeshift antidotes, if someone with the right knowledge was willing to risk everything on improvised chemistry. But attempting to synthesize cyanide antidotes using laboratory equipment he wasn't authorized to access would require revealing expertise that no night janitor should possess. It would mean abandoning the careful fiction that had protected his job security and Maya's educational stability, exposing himself as someone whose qualifications far exceeded his employment status. Worse, it would mean taking responsibility for medical intervention that could fail catastrophically, potentially facing criminal charges if his improvised treatment harmed rather than helped Emily Cooper. Richard's phone buzzed with a text message from Maya. "Can't sleep, working on science fair calculations. Love you, Dad." The message hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of everything he stood to lose if he revealed his true background. Maya's scholarship at Westfield Academy depended on his stable employment. Her dreams of following his scientific footsteps relied on the financial security his night job provided. Her future hung in the balance of decisions he made in the next few minutes. If he attempted to treat Emily using improvised antidotes and succeeded, he would face investigation about how a janitor possessed advanced toxicology knowledge. His employment history would be scrutinized, his credentials discovered, and questions raised about why someone with a Stanford PhD was working as a night cleaner. The background checks could reveal the medical debt, the financial desperation, the complete collapse of his academic career. Maya might learn the full extent of what he'd sacrificed for her mother's treatment and her own education. If he attempted treatment and failed, the consequences would be far worse. Emily Cooper's death following unauthorized medical intervention by unqualified personnel would trigger criminal investigation, potential manslaughter charges, and the complete destruction of everything he'd built to protect Maya's future. She would lose not just her father's support, but potentially her father himself, facing foster care or distant relatives while he served prison time for practicing medicine without a license. But the alternative was watching Emily die from a condition he could treat, carrying the knowledge that his silence had killed someone whose life was in his hands. Richard thought about the Hippocratic Oath he'd never formally taken but had always embraced in spirit: the obligation to use medical knowledge to preserve life, regardless of personal consequences. His toxicology research had been driven by the desire to save people from invisible dangers, to protect families from the kind of tragedy that had destroyed his own life when Sarah's experimental treatments failed. Emily's breathing became increasingly erratic, and Richard could see the progression of symptoms that indicated cellular damage was approaching irreversible levels. Her pulse was weakening, her skin color shifting toward the blue-gray tone that marked the final stages of cyanide poisoning. In perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less, her body would cross the threshold beyond which even perfect medical intervention couldn't restore normal cellular function. The building's elevator carried him to the chemistry lab with mechanical precision, while his mind wrestled with the moral calculus of expertise versus safety. Richard had spent 3 years convincing himself that protecting Maya's future justified any personal sacrifice, that his abandoned career was a worthwhile trade for her educational opportunities. But now that philosophy confronted a situation where inaction would make him complicit in preventable death. His key card, programmed for building-wide access as part of his cleaning duties, unlocked the chemistry lab's outer door. The familiar smell of reagents and equipment brought back memories of graduate school, of research projects that had once seemed capable of changing the world. The lab's inventory included everything he needed for emergency antidote synthesis: sodium nitrite, sodium thiosulfate, distilled water, and precision balances capable of measuring dosages accurate enough for human treatment. Richard's hands moved with muscle memory as he located the necessary chemicals, his scientific training overriding 3 years of janitor conditioning. The synthesis process was relatively straightforward for someone with advanced chemistry knowledge, creating solutions of precise molar concentrations that could be administered intravenously if he could figure out delivery mechanisms. The building's first aid stations included IV equipment, though using it would require medical skills that janitors definitely weren't supposed to possess. As he worked, measuring compounds with the precision that could mean the difference between life and death, Richard realized that this moment represented more than a choice between revelation and concealment. It was a test of whether his core identity as a scientist could coexist with his adopted role as a protective father, whether the knowledge that defined his intellectual life could be separated from the responsibilities that governed his practical decisions. The synthesized antidotes sat in carefully labeled beakers, their clear solutions representing the chemical difference between Emily's survival and death. Richard stared at the compounds he'd created, knowing that using them would irrevocably change everything about his life and Maya's future. Once he administered emergency medical treatment using advanced toxicology knowledge, there would be no returning to the safety of anonymity, no pretending that he was just a janitor who happened to be in the right place at the right time. His phone showed 12:03 a.m., and the sirens had stopped outside the building, indicating that paramedics were probably entering the lobby and would reach the 47th floor within minutes. Richard faced the final moment of choice: return to Emily's office with improvised antidotes and reveal himself as someone whose expertise could save her life, or destroy the evidence of his intervention and allow conventional medical treatment to arrive too late. Maya's future hung in the balance against Emily Cooper's life, his carefully constructed stability against his fundamental identity as someone who used scientific knowledge to protect people from harm. The choice would define not just what happened in the next few minutes, but who Richard Agustin would be for the rest of his life: the man who chose safety over service, or the scientist who risked everything to save a life when only he possessed the knowledge and capability to act. Richard carried the synthesized antidotes back to the 47th floor with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. The carefully measured solutions of sodium nitrite and sodium thiosulfate represented the culmination of years of abandoned expertise now focused on a single moment of life-or-death intervention. As the elevator climbed through the building's floors, he mentally rehearsed the administration sequence that could save Emily Cooper's life or destroy his own future in the process. Emily's condition had deteriorated significantly during his 15-minute absence. Her breathing was now barely perceptible, her pulse weak and irregular, and her skin had taken on the grayish-blue pallor that indicated cellular oxygen starvation was approaching critical levels. The cherry-red coloring around her lips had intensified, creating the paradoxical symptoms that confirmed cyanide poisoning for anyone with the knowledge to recognize them. Richard estimated she had perhaps 5 minutes before brain damage became irreversible, regardless of any subsequent treatment. The paramedics' voices echoed from the building's main elevator, indicating they'd reached the upper floors and were navigating toward the executive wing. Richard could hear their radio communications as they coordinated with hospital emergency departments, but their conversations focused on cardiac protocols and standard resuscitation procedures. Without specific information about cyanide poisoning, they would waste precious minutes on interventions that couldn't address Emily's actual condition. Richard knelt beside Emily's chair and gently lifted her arm, checking for venous access, while his mind calculated dosage requirements based on her estimated body weight and the progression of symptoms. His toxicology training included extensive work on antidote administration, but he's always practiced on laboratory animals or theoretical scenarios, never on a dying human being whose survival depended on his ability to translate academic knowledge into life-saving intervention. The first aid station's IV supplies were basic but functional: sterile needles, tubing, and saline bags that could serve as delivery mechanisms for the antidotes he'd synthesized. Richard's hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared the injection sites, his muscle memory overriding the 3 years of cleaning duties that had defined his professional identity. Every movement reflected the careful techniques he'd learned during graduate research, adapted now for emergency medical intervention. "Emily, if you can hear me, I'm going to help you," Richard said quietly, positioning the IV needle with the steady hands that had once pipetted solutions measured in microliters. "You've been poisoned with cyanide, but I have the antidotes that can counteract it. You're going to be okay." His voice carried the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what was happening and how to fix it, even as his heart raced with the knowledge that he was crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. The sodium nitrite went in first, a carefully calculated dose designed to convert hemoglobin to methemoglobin, creating cellular conditions that would bind with cyanide molecules and prevent them from disrupting oxygen metabolism. Richard monitored Emily's response as the antidote entered her bloodstream, watching for changes in skin color and breathing patterns that would indicate whether his improvised treatment was working. Within 2 minutes, Emily's breathing began to stabilize, becoming less labored as her cells regained some capacity to process oxygen. The blue-gray pallor started to fade, replaced by more normal coloring that suggested the sodium nitrite was successfully competing with cyanide for cellular binding sites. Richard felt a surge of relief mixed with professional satisfaction. His academic knowledge was translating into real-world results, saving a life through the application of principles he'd studied but never implemented under emergency conditions. The second antidote, sodium thiosulfate, followed immediately after the first had taken effect. This compound would bind directly with cyanide molecules, neutralizing them and allowing normal cellular metabolism to resume. Richard administered the dose with the same precision he'd once used for laboratory experiments, calculating concentrations that would be effective without causing additional toxicity. The margin for error was narrow, but his toxicology background provided confidence in dosage calculations that could make the difference between recovery and further complications. As the second antidote entered Emily's system, Richard heard the paramedics' footsteps approaching the executive wing. Their radio chatter indicated they were preparing for cardiac emergency protocols, still unaware that they were responding to an exotic poisoning case that required specialized treatment. Richard realized he needed to prepare them for what they would find: a patient whose condition had improved dramatically due to intervention by someone who shouldn't have possessed the knowledge or capability to provide such treatment. Emily's eyes fluttered open as the antidotes reached therapeutic levels in her bloodstream, her consciousness returning as normal oxygen metabolism resumed. She looked up at Richard with confusion and gratitude, struggling to understand what had happened and who had helped her. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "How did you know what was wrong?" "I have some medical background," Richard said carefully, beginning to clean up the evidence of his intervention while monitoring Emily's continued improvement. "You were poisoned with cyanide, probably in your coffee. The paramedics are here now, and they'll take you to the hospital for complete treatment and monitoring." He avoided mentioning the specific nature of his background, knowing that those questions would come later when Emily had recovered enough to demand full explanations. The paramedics burst into the office with equipment and urgency, expecting to find an unconscious executive requiring immediate resuscitation. Instead, they discovered Emily sitting up in her chair, talking coherently with a janitor who was calmly explaining that she'd been treated for cyanide poisoning using improvised antidotes. The lead paramedic, a veteran named Douglas Martinez, stared at Richard with bewilderment mixed with professional respect. "Sir, did you say cyanide poisoning?" Douglas asked, setting down his cardiac monitor while trying to process information that didn't match standard emergency scenarios. "How did you identify that, and what treatment did you provide?" His tone carried the careful neutrality of someone trained to gather information without making assumptions about capabilities or authority. "Classic symptoms: cherry red lips with cyanide breath odor, cellular oxygen deprivation despite adequate breathing," Richard explained, using medical terminology that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what janitors typically possessed. "I administered sodium nitrite followed by sodium thiosulfate, both synthesized from laboratory reagents available in the building. Dosages were calculated based on estimated body weight and symptom progression." Douglas and his partner exchanged glances that conveyed professional recognition of expertise they hadn't expected to encounter. "Sir, are you medical personnel? Those are very specific interventions that most people wouldn't know how to perform," Douglas said while his partner began taking Emily's vital signs and confirming that her condition had indeed improved dramatically. Richard realized that his moment of heroic intervention was transitioning into the aftermath that would require explanations he wasn't prepared to provide. The successful treatment had saved Emily's life, but it had also exposed capabilities that would inevitably lead to questions about his background, his qualifications, and why someone with advanced medical knowledge was working as a night janitor. The choice he'd made had succeeded in its immediate purpose, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. Emily Cooper was alive, conscious, and recovering from poisoning that would have killed her without intervention. Richard Agustin had proven that his abandoned expertise retained its power to save lives when circumstances demanded its application. But the janitor who had entered the building earlier that evening no longer existed, replaced by someone whose true identity was about to be revealed through questions that would reshape everything about his carefully constructed life. The heroic action was complete, but the real test was just beginning. The ambulance doors closed at 12:47 a.m., with Emily stable and conscious, her vital signs returning to normal ranges as the antidotes continued neutralizing the cyanide in her system. Richard stood in the hospital parking lot watching the vehicle disappear into the night, the red and blue lights fading into the distance along with any possibility of returning to his anonymous existence as a night janitor. The successful intervention had saved Emily's life, but it had also shattered the carefully constructed identity that had protected his employment and Maya's future for 3 years. Detective Sarah Rodriguez of the Riverside Police Department arrived at Meridian Technologies at 1:15 a.m., summoned by hospital protocols that required criminal investigation whenever poisoning cases involved potential homicide attempts. She found Richard in the executive break room, still wearing his janitor's coveralls, but surrounded by evidence that painted a complex picture of the evening's events. Empty chemical containers from the laboratory, detailed notes about antidote synthesis written in handwriting that demonstrated advanced scientific knowledge, and a coffee cup that preliminary field tests confirmed contained lethal concentrations of sodium cyanide. "Mr. Agustin, I understand you're the person who provided medical treatment to Miss Cooper," Detective Rodriguez said, setting into the chair across from him with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to conducting interviews that might continue for hours. The paramedics say you administered specific antidotes that most people wouldn't know how to synthesize, let alone calculate proper dosages for. I need to understand how you were able to do that. Richard had spent the past hour preparing for this conversation, knowing that his intervention would trigger exactly these kinds of questions. The choice he'd made to save Emily's life had been morally correct, but it carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate medical emergency. I have a background in toxicology, he said carefully, choosing his words to provide necessary information without volunteering details that might complicate the investigation further. "What kind of background?" Detective Rodriguez asked, consulting notes that suggested she'd already begun researching his employment history and finding discrepancies that didn't align with his current job title. "Because, according to Meridian Technologies' Human Resources Department, you're listed as a night janitor with no mention of any medical or scientific qualifications." The moment Richard had been dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. The intersection between his hidden past and his constructed present, where the fiction of his reduced circumstances would crumble under official scrutiny. "I have a PhD in toxicology from Stanford University," he admitted, the words feeling strange after years of concealment. "I specialized in antidote development and poison identification, with particular focus on industrial and environmental toxins." Detective Rodriguez paused in her note-taking, clearly processing the implications of employing someone with advanced scientific credentials in a custodial position. "Dr. Agustin, help me understand why someone with your qualifications is working as a night janitor. That's a significant career change that raises questions about motivation and background." Richard explained about Sarah's illness, the experimental treatments, the financial devastation that had followed her death, and his desperate need for employment that would support Maya's education while allowing him to be present for her daily needs. The detective listened with professional neutrality, but Richard could see her evaluating whether his circumstances provided credible explanation for the dramatic discrepancy between his qualifications and his employment status. "We'll need to verify your credentials and employment history," Detective Rodriguez said, making notes that Richard knew would trigger background investigations extending far beyond the immediate poisoning case. "More importantly, I need to understand how you identified the cyanide poisoning and decided to intervene rather than waiting for emergency medical personnel." Richard walked her through his observations over the past week, the crystalline residues, the damaged coffee machine components, the unusual symptoms affecting Emily and her assistant, and the pattern recognition that had led him to suspect deliberate poisoning. His explanation demonstrated systematic analysis that went far beyond casual observation, revealing the scientific mindset that had never truly disappeared, despite 3 years of custodial work. "The timing was critical," Richard explained. "Cyanide poisoning requires immediate intervention with specific antidotes. Even if the paramedics had arrived more quickly, they wouldn't have been equipped for exotic toxin treatment. By the time she reached a hospital capable of providing proper care, cellular damage would have been irreversible." As dawn broke over Riverside, Richard found himself in an interview room at police headquarters, providing detailed statements about his intervention while crime scene technicians processed Emily's office for evidence of who had attempted to kill her. The investigation had revealed that the cyanide had been introduced through a sophisticated delivery system involving Emily's personal coffee maker. Someone with intimate knowledge of her routines had been planning this attack for weeks. At 6:30 a.m., Richard's phone rang with Maya's daily wake-up call, a routine they'd maintained since she'd started middle school. "Dad, are you still at work? You usually get home before I leave for school," she said, her voice carrying the slight concern of someone's life had already included too much uncertainty about adult reliability. "Something came up at work, sweetheart. I might be late getting home today," he said, trying to keep his voice steady while surrounded by detectives and evidence bags. "Make sure you eat breakfast, and don't worry about me. I'll pick you up from school as usual." The conversation felt surreal, discussing morning routines while his entire life was being investigated and potentially dismantled. After Maya hung up, Detective Rodriguez returned with documents that confirmed Richard's academic credentials and revealed the full extent of his published research in toxicology journals. "Dr. Agustin, your intervention saved Miss Cooper's life, and that's commendable," she said, "but we need to discuss why you didn't report your suspicions about potential poisoning when you first noticed unusual symptoms and evidence." The question struck at the heart of Richard's dilemma. His fear of exposure had potentially endangered Emily's life by delaying intervention that could have prevented the acute poisoning episode entirely. "I wasn't certain enough to make accusations without proof," he admitted. "My observations were based on scientific knowledge that I wasn't supposed to possess in my current position. I was afraid that reporting suspicions would expose my background and jeopardize my employment." "Your employment that supports your daughter's education," Detective Rodriguez clarified, demonstrating that she understood the personal stakes that had influenced her decisions. "Dr. Agustin, I appreciate your situation, but withholding information about potential crimes because of personal concerns puts other people at risk." By 8 a.m., news of the attempted murder had reached Meridian Technologies' executive staff, and Richard received a call from Human Resources requesting his immediate presence for an emergency meeting. The hospital had released preliminary information about Emily's condition and the unusual circumstances of her treatment, creating questions about employee backgrounds and security protocols that the company needed to address immediately. Richard realized that his dual revelations, his hidden expertise, and his successful intervention would trigger employment consequences that extended beyond simple disciplinary action. Companies didn't typically retain employees who had concealed advanced qualifications, regardless of their personal motivations for doing so. The job that had supported Maya's education for 3 years was almost certainly over, leaving him to face the financial implications of unemployment while managing the personal costs of his heroic decision. The hospital called with updates on Emily's condition. She was stable, recovering well, and asking to speak with him personally when she was available. The medical staff wanted to understand more about his treatment methods and whether there might be lingering effects from either the poisoning or the improvised antidotes. Richard's intervention had been successful, but it had also created medical documentation that would follow both of them for years. As Richard left police headquarters and drove toward what would likely be his final meeting as a Meridian Technologies employee, he calculated the costs of his heroic action. Emily Cooper was alive because he'd chosen to act on knowledge that he wasn't supposed to possess. But that choice had exposed his true identity, jeopardized his employment, and potentially destabilized the careful financial structure that supported Maya's future. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the aftermath was just beginning to unfold in ways that would test whether doing the right thing could coexist with protecting the people he loved most. The story broke at 7:42 a.m. on Wednesday morning when Channel 8 News received a tip from someone inside Riverside General Hospital about the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Emily Cooper's rescue. By 9:15 a.m., the first video report was streaming online with the headline, "Janitor's Hidden PhD Saves CEO's Life in Midnight Poisoning Drama," transforming Richard's private decision into a viral sensation that would reach millions of people before the morning was over. The initial news coverage focused on the dramatic contrast between Richard's employment status and his life-saving expertise, painting a picture that captured public imagination with its David and Goliath overtones. A night janitor with a secret, Dr. Richard Agustin holds a PhD in toxicology from Stanford University, but has been cleaning offices for 3 years to support his daughter's education after medical debt destroyed his academic career, announced Rebecca Chen during Channel 8's morning broadcast, her voice carrying the breathless excitement reserved for stories that networks knew would generate massive audience engagement. Within 2 hours, the video had been shared across social media platforms with commentary that revealed how deeply the story resonated with Americans struggling with healthcare costs, employment challenges, and the collision between credentials and economic reality. "This is what medical debt does to families in America," wrote one Twitter user whose post received 50,000 retweets. A Stanford PhD working as a janitor because his wife's cancer treatment bankrupted them, but he still saved someone's life when it mattered. Richard discovered the viral explosion while sitting in Meridian Technologies' Human Resources office, where Director Catherine Walsh was attempting to navigate the unprecedented situation of an employee whose concealed qualifications had suddenly become national news. "Dr. Agustin, we need to discuss your employment status in light of recent revelations," she said, consulting legal documents that had been hastily prepared by corporate attorneys who specialized in crisis management rather than heroic janitors. "I understand," Richard replied, watching through the office windows as news vans gathered in the building's parking lot like circling predators, drawn by the scent of a story that combined corporate intrigue, hidden identity, and life-saving heroism. Catherine's expression suggested she was dealing with complexities that fell outside normal human resources protocols. "Dr. Agustin, the issue isn't just the concealed credentials, it's the fact that you used unauthorized access to laboratory equipment and chemical supplies to synthesize pharmaceutical compounds. Our insurance and liability departments are concerned about the precedent this sets for future situations." Meanwhile, the media attention was expanding beyond local news into national coverage as major networks picked up the story and began exploring its broader implications. CNN's midday broadcast featured a segment titled "The Hidden Costs of Healthcare When PhDs Become Janitors," while Fox News approached the story from the perspective of individual heroism overcoming institutional failure. Both narratives attracted enormous audiences hungry for stories that reflected their own struggles with economic uncertainty and healthcare affordability. Maya first learned about her father's viral fame when classmates at Westfield Academy showed her the news coverage on their phones during lunch period. "Maya, is this really your dad?" asked her friend Jessica, holding up a tablet displaying Richard's LinkedIn profile, which reporters had discovered and were using to document his impressive academic credentials. The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow as she realized that her father had been hiding the full extent of his professional sacrifice. She'd known he'd been a scientist before her mother's illness, but she hadn't understood that he'd abandoned a prestigious career with international recognition to work nights as a janitor. The viral videos showed crime scene footage, hospital interviews, and expert commentary about the sophistication of Richard's intervention, painting a picture of heroism that was far more complex than she'd imagined. By Wednesday afternoon, Richard's phone was receiving calls from literary agents offering book deals, documentary producers wanting exclusive access to his story, and pharmaceutical companies interested in consulting arrangements that could restore his scientific career. The most surprising call came from Dr. Margaret Foster, his former dissertation advisor at Stanford, who had seen the news coverage and wanted to discuss research opportunities that had opened up since his disappearance from academic circles. "Richard, I've been following your publications for years, wondering what happened when you stopped publishing," Dr. Foster said during their emotional phone conversation. "Your work on antidote delivery systems was groundbreaking. Several pharmaceutical companies have been asking about licensing your patents for commercial development. The royalties alone could provide significant income." The revelation that his abandoned research had continued generating interest and potential revenue added another layer of complexity to Richard's situation. He'd assumed that his academic work had become irrelevant during his years of caregiving and financial crisis, but the viral attention was drawing notice from scientific communities that had never forgotten his contributions to toxicology research. Emily Cooper, recovering in her hospital room, watched the news coverage with amazement and growing determination to ensure that Richard's heroism was rewarded rather than punished. "This man saved my life using knowledge that he's been hiding because our healthcare system destroyed his family's financial stability," she told the reporter conducting her first interview since the poisoning. If Meridian Technologies doesn't recognize the incredible asset they have in Dr. Agustin, then they're making a serious mistake. The most unexpected development came when Governor Patricia Williams announced during her weekly press conference that she wanted to present Richard with the state's highest civilian honor for heroism. Dr. Agustin represents everything we value about sacrifice, expertise, and moral courage, the governor said, creating political momentum that would make it difficult for Meridian Technologies to terminate his employment without appearing heartless and short-sighted. Social media amplified every aspect of the story, with hashtags like #JanitorPhD and #HiddenHeroes trending globally as people shared their own stories about overqualification, medical debt, and the gap between credentials and economic security. The narrative had evolved beyond Richard's individual situation into a broader conversation about healthcare affordability, employment discrimination, and the hidden talents that economic necessity forced people to suppress. The most touching responses came from other scientists who had faced similar career disruptions due to family medical crises. "I'm a PhD chemist working retail because my son's autism therapy costs $40,000 a year," wrote one commenter. Dr. Agustin's story shows that we're all one medical emergency away from having our careers destroyed by healthcare costs. By Thursday morning, the story had reached international audiences, with British and Canadian media using Richard's situation to highlight differences in healthcare systems and social safety nets. The BBC's coverage emphasized how medical bankruptcy, virtually unknown in countries with universal healthcare, had forced a brilliant scientist into custodial work, while his expertise remained hidden from potential employers and colleagues. Maya arrived home from school on Thursday to find their apartment surrounded by news crews and reporters seeking exclusive interviews with the family behind the viral story. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about all the research you did?" she asked, holding printouts of his published papers that her science teacher had helped her find in academic databases. "Mrs. Patterson says your work on poison detection is still being cited in current research. You're famous in the scientific community." Richard realized that the viral attention had accomplished something he'd never intended. It had revealed to Maya the full scope of what he'd sacrificed for her education and their financial stability. The hidden costs of his heroism were becoming visible not just to employers and the media, but to the daughter whose future he'd been trying to protect through 3 years of professional anonymity. The amplification was complete, but the real test was just beginning, as institutional forces prepared to respond to a story that had challenged comfortable assumptions about merit, employment, and the price of doing what's right when everything is at stake. By Friday morning, the Meridian Technologies Board of Directors convened an emergency meeting that would determine not just Richard's employment fate, but the company's response to a viral story that had positioned them as either enlightened employers of hidden talent or corporate villains who exploited overqualified workers. Board Chairman Harrison Webb presided over the tense session with the grim efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises that threatened shareholder value and corporate reputation. "Gentlemen, we face an unprecedented situation," Webb announced to the 8 board members assembled around the mahogany conference table. "Dr. Agustin's heroic actions have generated positive publicity for the company, but they've also exposed serious liability issues regarding unauthorized laboratory access, undisclosed employee qualifications, and potential insurance fraud related to his original employment application." The legal perspective transformed Richard's life-saving actions into a catalog of policy violations and potential criminal exposure that could devastate Meridian Technologies if other employees interpreted his case as precedent for similar unauthorized activities. What happens when every overqualified janitor decide they can access restricted areas because they believe their undisclosed expertise justifies rule-breaking? Morrison continued. Vice President of Human Resources Thomas Chen raised additional concerns about the broader implications of retaining Richard in any capacity. "The viral attention has created unrealistic expectations about employment practices and compensation structures," he argued. "Social media pressure is demanding that we promote Dr. Agustin to a scientific position, but doing so would validate the strategy of obtaining employment through credential concealment. Other applicants might conclude with misrepresenting qualifications leads to favorable outcomes if circumstances align properly." The discussion revealed the fundamental tension between public relations opportunities and institutional risk management that would define Meridian's response to Richard's situation. Board member Patricia Hoffman, whose pharmaceutical background provided insight into the scientific value of Richard's expertise, argued for a more nuanced approach that recognized both his contributions and the complexities of his employment status.
Dr. Agustin's research background is impressive, and his intervention saved Emily's life, Hoffman acknowledged. But we cannot ignore the fact that he violated company policies and potentially exposed us to significant liability. The appropriate response might be commendation for his heroism combined with termination for policy violations, allowing us to recognize his actions while maintaining institutional integrity. Meanwhile, external pressure was mounting from sources that carried considerable influence over Meridian's business relationships and regulatory standing. Governor Williams' office had contacted the company directly, expressing interest in recognizing both Richard's heroism and Meridian's response to his situation. The state's Economic Development Department, which provided tax incentives worth millions annually to Meridian Technologies, was monitoring the company's handling of the case as an indicator of corporate values alignment with state priorities. The governor's people are making it clear that our response will affect future state contracts and incentive programs, reported VP of Government Relations David Park. They're framing Dr. Agustin's case as a test of whether Wisconsin companies support workers who demonstrate extraordinary value regardless of their initial employment circumstances. The pharmaceutical companies that had contacted Richard about consulting arrangements were also applying indirect pressure through business channels. Dr. Margaret Foster had reached out to Meridian's research division, suggesting collaborative opportunities that could benefit both Richard's career restoration and the company's scientific capabilities. Several major pharmaceutical firms are interested in licensing Dr. Agustin's previous research, she'd explained. Meridian could position itself as the company that recognized his value and facilitated his return to meaningful scientific work. Emily Cooper's public statements were creating additional complications for the board's decision-making process. Her interviews had emphasized not just Richard's heroism, but the systemic issues that had forced him into custodial work despite his advanced qualifications. Meridian Technologies has a choice, she told CNN during her primetime interview. They can be the company that punishes an employee for saving my life, or they can be pioneers in recognizing that extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extraordinary responses. The most significant pressure came from Meridian's largest clients, several Fortune 500 companies whose procurement departments were fielding questions about their vendor relationships with firms that might terminate heroic employees for policy violations. The viral story had created a situation where Richard's employment status reflected not just on Meridian, but on every company that maintained business relationships with them. 3 of our major clients have contacted us expressing concern about potential public relations fallout if we terminate Dr. Agustin, reported Sales Director Amanda Cross. They're not making explicit threats, but they're asking detailed questions about our employment practices and worker treatment policies. The implication is clear. They're evaluating whether association with Meridian aligns with their corporate social responsibility commitments. Board Chairman Webb found himself navigating competing pressures that reflected the broader cultural tensions surrounding employment, healthcare, and corporate responsibility in modern America. The legal department advised termination to prevent precedent-setting policy violations. The public relations team recommended retention to capitalize on positive media attention. Government relations warned about political consequences that could affect future business opportunities. The fundamental question, Webb observed, is whether we treat Dr. Agustin's case as an isolated incident requiring standard disciplinary response or as an exceptional situation that demands innovative solutions. Both approaches carry risks, but they also create different precedents for future employee relations and corporate culture. The board's deliberations were complicated by the discovery that Richard's situation wasn't entirely unique within the company. Human research had identified at least 6 other employees whose educational backgrounds significantly exceeded their job requirements, though none to the dramatic extent of Richard's Stanford PhD. The revelation suggested that economic pressures had created a hidden population of overqualified workers whose actual capabilities remained unknown to management. Dr. Agustin might represent a broader talent management opportunity, suggested board member Robert Kim, whose technology background made him sensitive to the value of hidden expertise. Rather than viewing his case as a policy violation, we could treat it as evidence that our hiring practices aren't effectively identifying and utilizing available talent within our existing workforce. The meeting extended through Friday afternoon as board members wrestled with a decision that would affect not just Richard's future, but Meridian's corporate identity and approach to employee relations. The viral attention had transformed a simple employment decision into a test case for corporate values, worker treatment, and the balance between policy enforcement and human recognition. Outside the boardroom, protesters had gathered in support of Richard, holding signs reading, "Heroes don't deserve termination," and "Recognize talent, reward courage." The demonstration was small but symbolic, representing public sentiment that viewed Richard's potential firing as corporate callousness towards someone whose hidden expertise had saved a life. As the board prepared for their final vote, Webb realized that their decision would be scrutinized not just by Meridian stakeholders, but by a national audience that had invested emotionally in Richard's story. The choice between institutional consistency and human recognition would define the company's character and potentially influence how other corporations approached similar situations in the future. The institutional resistance was formidable, but the external pressures were equally powerful, creating a standoff that would test whether corporate culture could evolve in response to extraordinary circumstances that challenged comfortable assumptions about employment, expertise, and the hidden talents that economic necessity forced people to suppress. Monday morning arrived with the wake of resolution as Meridian Technologies prepared to announce their decision regarding Richard's future with the company. The emergency board meeting had concluded with a narrow vote that reflected the deep divisions between institutional risk management and public pressure for recognizing heroism. At 10 a.m., Richard received a call from Catherine Walsh requesting his presence for a meeting that would determine not just his employment status, but the precedent for how corporations handle employees whose hidden qualifications emerged through extraordinary circumstances.
Richard arrived at Meridian's headquarters to find the parking lot filled with news vans, protesters carrying signs supporting his cause, and counter-protesters arguing that policy violations shouldn't be excused regardless of heroic outcomes. The demonstration had grown since Friday, drawing supporters from across the region who viewed his case as symbolic of broader struggles with healthcare costs, employment discrimination, and corporate recognition of worker value beyond job descriptions. Dr. Agustin, before we begin, I want you to know that this meeting is being recorded for legal documentation purposes, Catherine Walsh announced as Richard entered the executive conference room where 5 board members waited with expressions that revealed nothing about their decision. We've prepared a comprehensive response to your situation that addresses both your heroic actions and the policy violations that brought us to this point. Board Chairman Harrison Webb assumed control of the proceedings with the measured authority of someone accustomed to delivering decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions in shareholder value. Dr. Agustin, your intervention saved Emily Cooper's life, and we recognize the extraordinary nature of your actions, he began, consulting prepared statements that had been carefully crafted to balance competing interests and legal considerations. However, we cannot ignore the fact that you gained employment through material misrepresentation of your qualifications, accessed restricted laboratory facilities without authorization, and used company resources to synthesize pharmaceutical compounds, Webb continued. These actions, regardless of their ultimate outcome, represent serious violations of company policy and potentially expose Meridian Technologies to significant liability concerns. Richard felt the familiar weight of institutional judgment settling over him, the same crushing pressure that had forced him to abandon his academic career when medical debt made his scientific expertise irrelevant to immediate survival needs. "I understand your concerns about policy violations," he replied carefully, "but I want you to understand the circumstances that led to those decisions and why I believe exceptional situations sometimes require responses that transcend normal operational guidelines." "Please explain," Webb said, though his tone suggested skepticism about whether personal circumstances could justify institutional rule-breaking that had created precedents for future employee behavior and corporate liability exposure. Richard stood and moved to the conference room's whiteboard, his scientific training compelling him to present his case with the same methodical precision he'd once used for academic presentations. 3 years ago, I faced a choice between maintaining my research career and providing the financial support my daughter needed after her mother's death from complications related to experimental medical treatments, he began, sketching a timeline that illustrated the collision between personal tragedy and professional obligation. I chose Maya's future over my career, accepting employment that would provide stability and health insurance while allowing me to be present for her educational needs, Richard continued, adding details about scholarship requirements, living expenses, and the mathematical reality of supporting a gifted child's academic development on custodial wages. I concealed my qualifications because I was afraid that overqualification would prevent me from getting hired for work that I desperately needed. The board members listened with expressions that gradually shifted from skeptical authority to something approaching uncomfortable recognition. Richard's explanation wasn't just personal justification, it was an indictment of economic systems that forced qualified people to hide their capabilities and accept work far below their competence levels to survive financial crises beyond their control. When I observed signs that someone was systematically poisoning Emily Cooper, I faced another impossible choice, Richard continued, documenting the week-long pattern of evidence that had led to his growing concerns. Report suspicions based on expertise I wasn't supposed to possess, potentially exposing my background and losing the job that supports my daughter's education, or remain silent and hope that conventional medical care would be sufficient if Emily's condition deteriorated. Corporate attorney Jennifer Morrison interrupted with questions designed to establish whether Richard had legal obligations to report suspected crimes regardless of personal consequences. "Dr. Agustin, when you identified potential poisoning symptoms, didn't you have a moral and possibly legal duty to warn Miss Cooper or contact authorities, regardless of how that might affect your employment status?" The question struck at the heart of Richard's dilemma, the conflict between protecting his constructed identity and fulfilling the responsibilities that came with his hidden expertise. "You're absolutely right," he admitted. "I should have acted sooner, but I was afraid that revealing my knowledge would destroy the stability I'd built for Maya's future. That fear nearly cost Emily her life, and I'll carry that responsibility forever." Richard's acknowledgement of his moral failure created an unexpected shift in the room's dynamics. Rather than defending his actions as entirely justified, he was accepting accountability for the consequences of personal security over public safety, a level of honesty that complicated the board's predetermined responses and legal frameworks. "The night Emily was poisoned, I couldn't hide anymore," Richard continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone reliving the most consequential decision of his life. "When I found her dying from cyanide poisoning, I had perhaps 10 minutes before brain damage became irreversible. I could follow protocol and watch her die, or use knowledge that 3 years of financial desperation had forced me to conceal." Maya Agustin appeared in the conference room doorway, having been escorted by security after requesting permission to address the board meeting that would determine her father's future. "Excuse me," she said, with the clear voice of someone who had inherited both her parents' intellectual courage and her father's determination to protect the people she loved. Webb looked uncertain about allowing a 12-year-old to participate in corporate disciplinary proceedings, but something in Maya's demeanor suggested she possessed information that might be relevant to their decision-making process. "Young lady, this is a private meeting about employment matters," he said gently. Emily Cooper's office, rebuilt and equipped with state-of-the-art security systems that prevented future poisoning attempts, displayed a framed photograph from the ceremony where Governor Williams had presented Richard with Wisconsin's highest civilian honor for heroism. The image captured a moment of recognition that had transcended individual achievement to become symbolic of hidden talents revealed through crisis and the institutional changes that could emerge when organizations chose transformation over tradition. The pharmaceutical licensing agreements are generating more revenue than we projected, Emily reported during their monthly research review meeting. Dr. Agustin's previous patents are proving valuable for companies developing improved antidote delivery systems. The royalties alone would have solved your family's financial problems years ago if anyone had known to pursue them. The revelation that Richard's abandoned research contained intellectual property worth hundreds of thousands in licensing fees had provided the most bitter irony of his entire journey. While he'd been struggling to support Maya's education through custodial work, his scientific contributions were generating profits for companies that had licensed his innovations without his knowledge or participation. The delayed royalties now funded scholarship programs for other families facing similar circumstances. Detective Rodriguez, who had been promoted following her exemplary handling of the poisoning investigation, visited the research center regularly to consult with Richard about forensic toxicology cases that local law enforcement encountered. "Dr. Agustin, we've got another suspected industrial poisoning case, and the symptoms don't match anything in our standard references," she announced during her latest visit. "The victim is a factory worker who's been experiencing gradual neurological deterioration over several months." Richard's expertise had become a regional resource for law enforcement agencies, medical facilities, and regulatory bodies dealing with exotic toxins and unusual poisoning cases. The consulting work provided additional income while allowing him to use his knowledge for public service that extended far beyond Meridian Technologies. The most profound transformation had occurred within Richard himself, the restoration of professional identity that integrated his roles as scientist, father, and someone whose life experience had taught him that expertise carried obligations that transcended job descriptions and institutional boundaries. He no longer felt the need to compartmentalize his knowledge or hide his capabilities to protect his employment security. Maya's bedroom, now decorated with advanced chemistry equipment alongside her childhood science fair ribbons, reflected the expanded possibilities that institutional support had created for her intellectual development. "Dad, I've been thinking about my college applications," she said during one of their evening homework sessions. "I want to study toxicology like you, but I also want to focus on healthcare policy research. I think there might be ways to prevent other families from facing the choices we had to make." The observation demonstrated that Maya had inherited not just her parents' scientific curiosity, but their commitment to using knowledge for broader social benefit. Her academic trajectory was no longer constrained by financial limitations or the need for her father to sacrifice career development for survival income. The Meridian Technologies annual report, released that spring, featured a cover story about the company's evolution from traditional manufacturing into specialized research and development that attracted top talent through innovative employment practices and recognition programs. Richard's case had become a model for other corporations seeking to identify and develop hidden capabilities within their existing workforces. "Sometimes I think about that night in October, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices," Richard reflected during a quiet moment in his laboratory, where sophisticated equipment hummed with the efficiency of properly funded research. Emily, who had become both a close friend and professional collaborator, looked up from the research proposal they were reviewing together. "You made the choices that seemed right at the time with the information you had available," she said. "But more importantly, when the moment came that truly mattered, you chose to save a life regardless of the personal consequences. That's the decision that defines your character." As evening approached and Maya prepared to leave for her advanced chemistry class at the community college, coursework that would transfer to whatever university ultimately earned her enrollment, Richard realized that their story had become something larger than individual triumph over adversity. It had demonstrated that hidden talents exist throughout the workforce, that economic crises often concealed rather than destroyed human capabilities, and that institutions willing to recognize and develop those capabilities could benefit both individual families and broader communities. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. A continuing evolution of how society valued expertise, supported families facing medical crises, and created pathways for people whose circumstances had forced them to suppress their greatest capabilities. Richard Agustin had saved more than Emily Cooper's life that October night. He had saved his own identity and created possibilities for countless others whose talents waited for recognition, support, and the chance to contribute to something larger than mere survival. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
"It's about my mom," Maya replied, her composure remarkable for someone her age addressing a room full of adults whose decision could reshape her life. "Everyone talks about how my dad gave up his career for me, but that's not the whole truth. He gave up his career to save my mom. And when that didn't work, he rebuilt his life around making sure I could have the future she wanted for me." Maya's presence transformed the corporate meeting into something more personal and profound, a confrontation between institutional protocols and the human stories that policy decisions affected in ways that quarterly reports couldn't measure. "My dad didn't hide his education because he was ashamed of it," she continued. "He hid it because he was afraid people like you would think he was too good for work that he needed to support his family." "Maya, you don't need to," Richard began, but she held up her hand with the authority of someone who had learned to speak for herself when adults' decisions affected her future. "He saved that woman's life because that's who he is," Maya said, addressing the board with the directness that corporate executives rarely encountered from people who weren't seeking their approval or fearing their authority. "He's been saving my life every day for 3 years by working a job that he was overqualified for just so I could stay in school and have the chances my mom wanted me to have." The room fell silent as Maya's words settled over the assembled board members, forcing them to confront the human consequences of their decision in ways that legal frameworks and policy considerations couldn't capture. This wasn't just about employment violations or liability management. It was about a family that had survived tragedy through sacrifice, and whether institutional interests would recognize or punish the kind of hidden heroism that economic necessity forced people to practice daily. Emily Cooper chose that moment to enter the conference room, moving slowly but deliberately with the support of her personal assistant. Her presence represented the living evidence of Richard's intervention and the most powerful testimony about the value of recognizing expertise wherever it existed. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice still weak but determined, "but I couldn't let you make decisions about Dr. Agustin's future without hearing from the person whose life he saved." 6 months later, Dr. Richard Agustin stood in the newly constructed Meridian Technologies Advanced Toxicology Research Center, watching Maya conduct her first official experiment using professional-grade equipment that would have been unimaginable during their years of financial struggle. The 15,000-square-foot facility, designed specifically around his research expertise and intended to position Meridian as a leader in industrial safety science, represented the most visible transformation that had emerged from that October night when everything changed. "Dad, the spectrometer readings are showing exactly the results you predicted," Maya announced from the analytical station, where she was testing her hypothesis about how different industrial compounds affected aquatic organisms. At 13, she had grown into her intellectual gifts with the confidence that came from knowing her dreams were not just supported but actively cultivated by institutions that recognized potential regardless of age or conventional expectations. The Toxicology Center had been Emily Cooper's vision, developed during her recovery as a way to ensure that the life-saving expertise that had rescued her would benefit far more people than just one grateful CEO. "If Dr. Agustin's knowledge could save my life using improvised equipment in an office building," she'd argued during board presentations, "imagine what he could accomplish with proper resources and institutional support. We have an opportunity to transform a crisis into competitive advantage while doing something genuinely beneficial for workplace safety."
Richard's new position as Director of Applied Toxicology had come with a salary that finally matched his qualifications, comprehensive health insurance that eliminated the financial anxiety that had dominated their lives for years, and research budgets that allowed him to pursue investigations he'd abandoned when Sarah's medical needs consumed all available resources. More importantly, it had come with the institutional recognition that expertise deserved to be used rather than hidden, regardless of the circumstances that had initially concealed it. The transformation of Meridian Technologies extended far beyond Richard's individual case. Emily's near-death experience had prompted comprehensive reviews of employee background screening that revealed dozens of workers whose actual qualifications significantly exceeded their job descriptions. The company had established talent mobility programs that allowed overqualified employees to transition into roles that better utilized their capabilities, creating career pathways that recognized life experience and hidden expertise alongside formal credentials. The Agustin Protocol, as it had become known in human resources circles, established frameworks for identifying and developing talent that economic circumstances had forced into concealment. Other companies were adopting similar approaches, recognizing that financial crises often created pools of qualified workers whose desperation made them accept employment far below their competence levels. Maya's Science Fair project, which had won the regional competition and advanced to national finals, had evolved into something far more sophisticated than her original proposal about environmental toxins. Working alongside her father in his professional laboratory, she had developed testing methods that could identify trace contaminants in industrial settings, potentially preventing the kind of systematic poisoning that had nearly killed Emily Cooper. Mrs. Chen from Stanford called again, Maya reported, referring to the admissions coordinator who had been tracking her academic progress since news coverage revealed her family story. She says the university wants to discuss early admission possibilities for high school students interested in toxicology research. Apparently, having a published paper at 13 is pretty unusual. The research paper Maya had co-authored with her father, documenting improved detection methods for industrial contaminants, had been accepted by the Journal of Applied Toxicology, making her one of the youngest researchers ever published in peer-reviewed scientific literature. The achievement represented not just academic recognition, but the realization of dreams that financial constraints had nearly made impossible.